This is Dr. Patrick Burnett. This lecture will cover Chapter 4, which is all about costs. Now, whether you wind up working in finance or just using it as a manager or administrator, understanding costs is pretty important. So I'm going to touch on some of the key concepts and show you some of the key calculations. One of the more subtle distinctions is this thing called relevant costs, which basically means costs that change based on a given decision. Humans have this horrible tendency, they call it sunk cost bias. You see it right there. And what that is that we make decisions based on costs that we've already sunk into a project. So if I'm in the middle of, let's say, building a house, and I've already paid for the foundation, a lot of times I consider that cost, the money I spent building the foundation, as relevant, when in fact it's not, because going forward I still have to decide if it's worth building the rest of the house or if I should just accept that loss. But again, because humans have this sunk cost bias, we think of that basement cost as something that can change based on future actions, when indeed it can't. Some other definitions: direct costs are just those costs that are generally directly involved with production, right there. And they also vary more or less directly with the number of goods or services. So your nursing hours would be a direct cost to the extent that the number of hours goes up with the number of patients. Now, indirect costs are also often termed overhead costs, and that's basically your administrative costs, or the costs of widely shared resources like building common space or parking lots. Parking lot is a good example because generally you want a parking lot big enough for the maximum expected load. Think about a shopping mall, for example. That parking lot is overhead space for all the stores in the mall. And it's generally built to handle all the cars expected during a holiday rush, meaning it's empty most of the rest of the time. So since the size of that parking lot doesn't change based on time of year, it's you could partially consider it kind of a fixed overhead cost. And then if you just add that direct and that indirect cost, then that's going to be your full cost. Now, rather than look at the definitions of fixed, variable, and so forth, it's going to be easier to jump over to Excel and give you an actual example. Now, in the reference worksheet, you can see we're in tab C04T, T for textbook, Chapter 4 textbook. So we're going to start with two very basic bits of information. One is your fixed costs, and that's $10,000 in this example. So there's $10,000 of something that you can't get away from, your rent or something like that. You pay that whether you have produced 0 units or lots of units. And then speaking of units, this is how much it costs you to produce each unit, $30. So this table over here just takes those two bits of information and constructs a little table. So if your quantity right here, quantity is 0, 100, 200, all the way up to 700. So you've got your quantity there, and then you've got your fixed costs. Notice that the fixed costs, because they're fixed, don't change with quantity. They're always $10,000. And your variable costs, you can actually look into the formulas that we have in this worksheet. We'll just press F2 to look at the formula, or you could also see the formula right up there in the address bar. So the formula is the quantity times that cost per unit right over there. So that's how we build our fixed cost and our variable cost. The variable cost, true to form, goes up with quantity because it's basically looks like it was $30 per unit, so that keeps going up in increments of $30. we add these two together going down, and again, you can look at the formula right there, and you can see it right there. So we add the formula, add those numbers rather, to give us a total cost across for all units. So let's do a little graph. Now making this graph is as easy as highlighting this, doing a little insert, a line graph, and that kind of graph. And you can see we created basically essentially the same thing we just did, although I have a neater version, so I'll get rid of that one. And you can see here that we have the quantity going along the bottom from 0 to 600 or 700, just like we have here. And then you've got dollars going along. The variable cost, that's the one that goes from 0 up to 21,000. Over there, that goes up like that. It starts at 0. And out at 700, which is in here, it's about, what does it say? About 2100, and there's the 20. So yeah, so it's right there. Your fixed cost is always flat because it's always the same amount no matter how much quantity. You add this line and this line up vertically, and you can see that the green line is just the fixed cost amount higher than that total variable cost. So now we've plotted our total costs. Now let's move down a little bit and take those same numbers we had up there and do a little math with them. Our fixed cost per unit, and again, what we're doing is, I'll show you the formula, and you can see the fixed cost per unit at this one is just your total costs divided by the number of units. Same thing there, but the different column, and so on. Now your variable cost per unit is similar. I'll just hit F2 so you can see where the formula is coming from. Although actually, remember, we were already told it's always $30 a unit. So your variable cost per unit, straighten that out, is always 30 going across. So we have our fixed costs per unit, and you can see that those go down over quantity. And the reason is it's always the same amount, but you're dividing it by a bigger and bigger number. So the number per unit naturally goes down. And then again, we just looked at the total cost per unit by adding these two up. Now let's make a graph of that. Same way we would highlight this, and we would say insert a graph, a line graph, and it would look like that. But we have the version already nicely formatted here. So in this one, you can see that your variable cost per unit now is fixed because we always paid the same amount per unit in variable costs. But your fixed cost per unit, which is the blue line here, it starts high and then it keeps going down, and that is because that fixed cost is being spread over more and more units. So the more units we spread it over, the lower it becomes per unit. And then when we add the red line and the blue line vertically going upwards, that amount is going to give you the green line, which is your total cost per unit. Now, thinking ahead, now that we know our total cost per unit, we also have a clue as far as where our price, our break-even price, or where to set the price will be. Because if you're, let's say here, for example, at 400 units, our average cost is around $60. And we can actually check that in the table. It's $55 per unit, we can see. So if our revenue is $55 a unit, we would know that once we were producing 400, where our average costs had come down to 55, and notice that those costs are coming down because we're spreading that fixed cost over more and more units. As our costs come down per unit, if the price we were getting was 55, at that point we know we'd be breaking even at 400. But we're going to look at that in a little more detail right now.